Autonomy, but what about public transportation? How does Tesla think about the challenge of urbanization, which is one of the mega trends that UBS has written about a lot, and density in cities? And for example, I live in Hong Kong, and actually you really wouldn't want any more cars. Now, I totally agree we want to swap out the internal combustion engines with electric vehicles, but is there a question about whether we should have individual cars at all? And
Yep.
what's your philosophy around that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's two ways that we're thinking about applying our technology. So our technology is about autonomous cars as well as electric cars. So two ways. One is when you buy a car, and probably in the next 5 to 6 years, when you buy a Tesla, you drive it to work, or it drives you to work, because you won't need to drive it anymore, and then drops you off at work, and it goes off to work for you as a Lyft or Uber style system. So the car is picking up people and driving people around, eliminating the need for those people to buy a car, and eliminating the need for you to park your car and use up that valuable real estate with a parked car that's just sitting there for 8 to 10 hours.
Isn't that just a transition though? Because wouldn't the ultimate
Yeah.
be nobody needs a car and everyone uses a Tesla, Uber?
So I said there's two ways. So that was the first way. The second way is to have people movers that are also autonomous, that are just electric buses basically, that are on almost like an airport tram, but much more flexible. It's not just on a single track of, they're stopping at certain places or wherever the person wants to get off, and the thing is just driving around without a driver.
So
it's a people mover.
You're starting to look at these kinds of systems, because it's not just a vehicle, it's an entire system.
Exactly.
Would need to be built.
Yeah. Just like we did the whole infrastructure for the supercharger, we would build a whole infrastructure for these sort of vehicles. But we're still a startup company. We're not even 15 years old, and we got to take small chunks at a time. But that's definitely in the background. But the first thing and the low-hanging fruit is the idea of your car not just sitting around for you, but making money for you. And hopefully there's less cars on the road for that reason in general.
And I guess there's not going to, most of the United States, or Mexico for that matter, is not going to be anything like Hong Kong anytime soon.
In terms of the
it's going to take a while.
Density of population? Oh, in terms of what?
Just in terms of density.
Oh, yeah.
So Dave, what's your view of that question? Because a lot of your homes, well, the Californication house is not an apartment building, and there's an argument from an environmental perspective that we need to create dense and basically high-rise communities which are all walkable. How do you see the balance between having a gorgeous low-rise house with lots of vegetation and a swimming pool and everything, and what we probably need to get to for a sustainable city, which is most people living in high-rises, even if those high-rises have vegetation?
Yeah, one thing I was just going to say as a segue to Javier's answer is that, like, when I look at my Model X and it's charged most of the time, I think, why aren't I not using that energy as backup for my house? Because that's a great battery. I already have essentially a Tesla wall battery. If you had to deplete the car to keep your refrigerator in a power outage, that might be a trade-off. So, of course, Los Angeles is a very horizontal city, and we have a lot of land. If you're on an island or a dense area like Tokyo or Hong Kong, and over thousands of years is developed, that it becomes a denser city. Densification can be both a positive thing and a negative thing. There's a lot of resistance to suburban sprawl. The model that was largely developed in Los Angeles was very much around transportation, because we had public transportation, and it was actually the automotive industry that got rid of the public transportation specifically to put in an infrastructure that almost required people to live in one place and work in another. So, one of the things that I think will happen in the future, especially with driverless cars, is that there will be unused space within the cities because there won't be the infrastructure. I mean, imagine, I drive by gas stations. I just love the idea that I'm not a part of the, that industry. Well, you go into a Tesla factory, there's not, it's a perfect room like this. I mean, there's not oil and emissions, and so that you can start to reduce the amount of area devoted to the automobile. When we design buildings, especially in California, we start with how many cars we're going to park. I mean, the whole use is defined by just parking these giant pieces of machinery that are moving a couple 100 pounds, but they weigh thousands and thousands of pounds and use a lot of energy to get there. So if every car is lighter, like the hypercar concept, they don't have to worry about impact. But now the cars have to be engineered to withstand a Suburban, a big SUV hitting them. So I guess it's a long way. The transportation and density is inextricably linked in the city, and if we were to do away with cars, for instance, in a city, then we could infill that space with more housing, and transit-oriented development is kind of the buzzword in, say, Los Angeles, where we're now rebuilding the infrastructure that we took out so that people could live and work closer and then not be as dependent on the car. They may still want a car to get away, and the idea that that car can go into a shared economy model or become an energy source when it's idle is wonderful. And maybe one person doesn't own that car. Maybe several people own that car.
So I'm a huge fan of your philosophy, and I used to have chickens and vegetables in my backyard as well when I lived in Sydney, Australia. But I'm also aware that, there is efficiency in mass production. There's efficiency in, large-scale agriculture. And I tell you what, I wouldn't have wanted to live off my vegetable garden in Sydney. So I guess just to be devil's advocate, how much of that sort of urban gardening movement is more community-oriented rather than genuine production of food for real?
In Venice, with the nonprofit we work with, Community Healing Gardens, there's 82 urban farm boxes in an area that has a lot of Section 8 or affordable housing, and the food is used. I mean, these are people that aren't going to the Whole Foods to buy produce necessarily. It definitely doesn't meet the production needs of the population, and it definitely is much more of a societal and social and feel good and community based movement. But it has the potential to feed. For instance, my wife and I have some aeroponic food towers like the ones I showed, just little vertical tower, and we give away produce to as many friends and neighbors because we make so much more produce than we can possibly harvest with no soil and with no space. So if you are talking about densification, you could have a balcony, you can put it in your living room, you could use artificial light. I think there's no question that the production rates in small controlled areas of produce in the future will be much, much higher.
But there is a big difference between production by professionals and production by hobbyists, right? So I know a friend of mine, David Rosenberg, has Aero Farms, which is the largest vertical farming operation, I think, in the world in New Jersey. And I mean, it is a scientific sort of enterprise with all kinds of experimentation and, very highly qualified agricultural engineers there doing that. So but some of the slides you were saying also appear to be building in professional agricultural production into the urban environment as well.
There was really only one slide that looked at like a shipping container that is completely self-sufficient and monitored, and that there are some startups with the LA Clean Tech Incubator that have a very sophisticated modeling. But I think with anything, these things come down to being able to be done by an individual. I mean, it's really not very sophisticated. If you have a food tower and you have a starter growth or seed, one could grow that. One of the things we were looking at in Haiti, for instance, is water generation, say at a schoolyard with solar. But then the plants are grown in a greenhouse, so one would come and they would have, say, get a tower, and they would put it in their courtyard, and they would be given some education about how that is grown, and they'd be given, small starter plants, and they would be given water and nutrients, and so that could start to spread out instead of one central place that you go in that model. So all these technologies end up perhaps first being the kind of elite or people that have unique knowledge, but I think that they can filter out to become more ubiquitous.
I think there are also some really interesting automated like farm bots, which are doing everything from manually zapping weeds so that you don't have to use large-scale herbicides, or spraying very precisely on the weeds based on optical recognition of particular leaf shapes or spectrums of the green of a particular weed. So that's a really interesting development. And when we talk about in countries like Bangladesh or other countries that have apparel industry or this sort of manual labor which will be eliminated by automation, one of the areas that could be a solution is if they can automate with very low-cost robotics and dramatically improve their own productivity. That could be a way for them to develop.
So I was just going to say, as a segue from that, I was reading an article about drones being used to reforest remote areas, and with incredible efficiency, they're using drones and shooting these seed bombs into the ground. So it's almost like a bullet that shoots a seed, and within the seed there's a little bit of water and nutrients, and the take rate of these kind of reforestation bombs by drones is phenomenal. And so I think that's a good case where you're saying we're using a technology. It's relatively simple to achieve very, very high restorative effects.
So Javier, back to that sort of challenging the scale issue. How do you, well, first of all, do you have any statistics on what proportion of the market could be covered with the power walls or the roof tiles? I know it's still very early days in terms of deployment, but try to give us a sense of the scale. How do we replace, that massive gas and coal baseload, in the energy system?
It's really hard to say a time frame for that, but the good news is that the cost is not ridiculous. It's just going to be. A good analogy is like when 15 years ago, when you wanted to buy a flat screen TV for your house, you get a 42-inch TV that was about this thick, weighed a ton, and it was $15,000, right? So now that same television is much better, much thinner, at 42 inches, $300, right? And everybody in the world that would have a TV has a flat screen TV. So that was pretty quick because it's a smaller item, but that's going to happen. The batteries are going to go down in price. The price of solar cells are going to go down as more people put them in their homes, and it just makes sense to have an electric car along with those other items. There's just no other. Like, why would you go anywhere else for whether it's Tesla or not? Doesn't really matter. Our mission is still the same, and we encourage other car companies and other companies to get into electric vehicles, so they become ubiquitous,
and what about,
it's not a novelty.
What about the life cycle of the panels and the batteries? And I guess one of the, I don't know, I haven't looked at the data, but the whole life cycle assessment, if you look at the manufacturing process and the recycling process, I've heard, and it might be just one of those skeptic myths, that the life cycle assessment isn't as positive once you take into account all the manufacturing emissions and so on. What's the latest data on that?
Our batteries, first of all, are the recycling, the amount of recycling material you can reach for each battery is in the 90%. They're all aluminum. As you know, aluminum is one of the easiest materials to recycle wholly. So the recyclability of the batteries is much better than any other product that goes into any other type of vehicle. And then we are actively looking to see how we're going to we can't make enough batteries right now to cover the demand that we have for our cars. And we have a gigafactory in Nevada that we make specifically to make batteries for homes and for the cars. And we're producing more batteries than the entire production of all the batteries in the world combined for computers, for cell phones, you name it. So just that plant alone. And that's not enough. So now we really have to think really hard where we're going to make the cars, because we're making the cars in Fremont, California, and we're making the batteries in Reno, Nevada. We got to carry either cars to the batteries or batteries to the cars, versus having one place where you do it all. And then what you do for China, you take the cars from the United States to China, doesn't make sense, or to Europe. So as we're growing up as a company, we're looking at that cradle to grave scenario for everything that we do.
Okay, great. So any questions from the audience? I've got a question that came in before about impact investing and how relevant it's becoming to investors' portfolios. So think about your questions, but I'll answer this one first. The impact and sustainable investing is growing incredibly fast amongst our client base, and it's driven by a lot of the trends that we're seeing, and all of the trends that we've seen today is sustainability and solving problems around social and environmental issues. There's money to be made. It's the direction of travel. It's where business is going. So there's a lot more to invest in, and then clients are starting to demand it. And particularly what we're finding is our women clients and our millennial clients have a higher affinity for sustainability than the older traditional male clients, but even they are getting much more interested. So we are, responding as and launching new strategies and new products, but it really has to come from that client demand. So we are finding a lot. Now, one thing that has been an incredibly positive development is that now sustainable and impact investing is across asset classes. So before you had some sort of venture capital and early stage startups in the sort of sexy clean tech and so on, and you always had ways of investing in listed equities where you just kick out the bad guys. But now you have really sophisticated asset managers across the board. All the big asset managers now have sustainability funds. You've got, for example, World Bank bond funds and green bond funds, and green bonds are funding sustainability projects, renewable energy, public transportation, green buildings, these kind of things. And then you have bonds of leading companies, and then equities. You have just so many different types of strategies, whether it's gender lens products, which are companies which invest, treat women well and empower women in the workforce, and so on. And then to private markets, you now have some of the largest private equity firms in the world, like TPG and KKR, stepping up and launching impact funds, which are focused on renewables, EdTech, education technology, which I'm sure we'll hear about a lot tomorrow, growth infrastructure, agricultural yield improvement in developing countries, fintech in developing countries. So when you think about sustainable and impact investing, 10 or more years ago, it was kind of probably not the place you'd go to make money. People would think of it more as an ethical alignment thing, where you do it for your values, but that's not where you go to make money. What's fundamentally changed, and I hope you would agree after hearing the presentations today and what you'll hear tomorrow, is sustainability and these mega trends that are solving human problems are actually the most interesting ways to make money. This is where the future is going. So let's get another couple of questions from the audience. Yes.
I don't think we're selling them in Mexico yet. You can order them and put a reservation in for your house, but they're not being installed in Mexico yet.
Yes?
It's commendable, so congratulations. Recently, I'm from Puerto Rico. Recently, there was a big storm, destroyed the island. I know that Tesla had been in conversations with the country to try to turn it into something other than just rebuilding what was already broken. Do you have any what that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a very similar situation to what we did in Kauai. But we put solar farms. We were running, I think, a couple of hospitals we installed solar farms right after the hurricane and battery systems so that the hospitals were running completely off the grid in San Juan. But yeah, that's scaling that same situation up. There's a lot of land in Puerto Rico on the island that can be used for a solar farm and a battery farm. And then, like you said, it won't be broken anymore. That's the way it should have been done properly in the beginning, because the infrastructure is such that it's, there's corruption and there's things that get installed improperly and so forth, and it's just a very fragile infrastructure for their energy. So I'm hoping that will, as we put that system in place for the hospitals, that'll just start reproducing itself, because the amount of surface area you need of energy production with solar panels is very small. The ratio is very small to power a very large area. Can't remember what the ratio is, but it's ridiculously small. Like, you'd be blown away how small it is.
Final question. I'll follow Alex's lead. What books would you recommend, or book would you recommend for people that has been really influential?
To me, it sounds really simple, but I read a book a few years ago that really changed the way I was thinking about things in general, and it's not a very specific book, but it's called Who Moved My Cheese? And Who Moved My Cheese? And it was basically, I read it many years ago, but it's simplifying things of, like, if it's about two mice. I don't know if you've heard that book or anything.
I've heard of it, but haven't read it.
It's about two mice, basically, and a cheese gets moved, and it's how one approaches why the cheese was moved and what can they do next time so the cheese is not moved at all, instead of just solving the problem of the cheese never being moved at all. And it's just that very simple way of approaching a problem. And my life revolves around problem solving, the most efficient way, and that was a really interesting way of thinking. So I love that book. Yeah.
I was going to answer your question. In Puerto Rico, we've been working with the Ricky Martin Foundation on the donation of SkyWater machines. And, when we were talking about infrastructure, let's say, a city had telephone lines or power lines, but then they have to put that in, or they can just go to cell phones directly versus telephone wires. They just leapfrog that. And so these disasters could be an opportunity to rethink the infrastructure and not rebuild it in the same centralized way. And so the solution now is a Band-Aid solution, which is just dump a bunch of water bottles there and then leave all the trash of the water bottles, rather than let's help rebuild the infrastructure from start, whether it's energy or water. And one of the things about atmospheric water generators is not a central big infrastructure that's very slow, and so it could be responsive, and it could provide resilience against that. So they could be deployed rapidly to other islands throughout the Caribbean, or if one part of the island has an issue, they can be done more rapidly. So, and answer your question about books, I use the word abundance a lot because I read Peter Diamandis's book, Abundance, which was a very interesting take because so many of the books that I had read about the environment before were about the problem, and it's easy to become disillusioned or discouraged by the severity of the problems. And this really, that idea of abundance, not scarcity, because of this book by Peter Diamandis, really said, well, there's a lot more that humans can do with their ingenuity, with their creativity, to use resources more efficiently. And so that's been kind of a latest inspirational book.
Well, thanks very much, and let's put our hands together for our guest speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we have lunch.